What if the man who saved an entire army's flank, the man who moved faster, harder, and more brilliantly than any general in the Western theater of World War II, was nearly destroyed not by the enemy, but by the very institution he served? What if the most pivotal military decision of the European campaign wasn't made in a war room, but in the restless, defiant mind of a general who refused to wait for permission? And what if, years later, the president who had commanded him would sit across from his successor and quietly confess what George S. Patton had really done? Not the version written in official dispatches, but the raw, staggering truth of a soldier who rewrote the rules of modern warfare while his superiors were still reading the old ones. This is not a legend. This is history, and it cuts deeper than any Hollywood script ever could. If this kind of story moves you, the kind that reaches behind the medals and the monuments to show you what leadership truly costs, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear that history is far more extraordinary than we were ever taught, and drop a comment telling us what you already know about Patton, because by the end of this, something will surprise you. Every subscribe helps this story reach someone who deserves to hear it. George Smith Patton Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, into a family that had bled for America since the Revolutionary War. He graduated from West Point in 1909, competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, and was among the first officers to command American tank units in World War I. By the time World War II erupted across Europe, Patton had spent decades forging himself into something rare, a commander who studied war the way a surgeon studies anatomy, with obsessive precision and absolute conviction. He read Caesar, Napoleon, Rommel. He believed, genuinely, almost mystically believed, that he had been a warrior in past lives. That belief wasn't vanity. It was fuel. It drove him to a standard of operational audacity that his contemporaries could barely comprehend, let alone match. When Dwight D. Eisenhower, then Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, looked at his available generals in 1944, there was no one who combined Patton's raw instinct for momentum with his ability to translate that instinct into coordinated armored maneuver. No one. And Eisenhower knew it. He also knew that Patton was, in equal measure, the most brilliant and the most dangerous officer under his command. The moment that would define everything, the moment that Truman would one day describe to Eisenhower with a mixture of awe and barely suppressed disbelief, began in the freezing forests of the Ardennes in December 1944. On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Autumn Mist, the massive German counteroffensive that the world would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge. German armored divisions, led by SS Panzer units, smashed through thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, creating a massive salient, a bulge, that threatened to split the Allied armies in two and potentially reach the vital port of Antwerp. More than 80,000 American soldiers were surrounded at Bastogne. The situation was catastrophic. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, was stunned. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding British forces to the north, was cautious, slow, methodical, qualities that had their place in warfare but were lethal luxuries in a crisis. Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun on December 19, 1944. The pressure in that room was enormous. American soldiers were dying by the thousands in the snow and ice of Belgium, and the Allied High Command needed a miracle, or at least the closest thing to one that existed in uniform. At the Verdun conference, Eisenhower asked his commanders how long it would take to relieve the trapped American forces at Bastogne. Most generals gave cautious, qualified answers. Bradley's staff spoke of days, perhaps longer. The logistics were genuinely terrifying. Moving entire Army Corps in winter conditions, across icy roads in the opposite direction they had been advancing, required a level of planning that normally took weeks. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. Patton's answer was delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had already made up his mind before the question was asked. He said he could have 3 divisions attacking northward toward Bastogne within 48 hours. The room went silent. Eisenhower, accustomed to military understatement and careful hedging, thought for a moment that Patton was joking, or at least exaggerating. He pressed him. He asked Patton if he truly understood what he was proposing, turning an entire army in winter in 48 hours and driving it north into the teeth of a German offensive. Patton said yes. And then he did something that floored everyone in that room. He reached into his pocket and revealed that he had already issued preliminary orders to 3 of his divisions before leaving for the conference, anticipating that this would be asked of him. What Patton had done defied every conventional principle of military command and control. He had, without explicit authorization, begun the process of reorienting the Third Army southward, and then north toward Bastogne, before Eisenhower had formally requested it. He had read the strategic situation, calculated the only logical Allied response, and started moving. He had changed orders, rerouted an entire army's trajectory, based not on what he had been told to do, but on what he had determined needed to be done. This was not insubordination in the legal sense, because no contradictory order existed. But it was something that walked right up to the line of command authority and stared over the edge. It was the act of a man who trusted his own judgment more than he trusted the speed of the chain of command. On December 22, 1944, elements of Patton's Third Army began smashing northward through brutal winter terrain. By December 26, 1944, the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, broke through the German encirclement and reached the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, relieving the 101st Airborne Division and fundamentally turning the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. The speed of Patton's movement became one of the most studied feats of operational logistics in military history. In less than 72 hours, not 48 as he had promised but faster, he had pivoted 3 full divisions, moved them across icy, narrow European roads in near-blizzard conditions, coordinated artillery support, supply lines and air cover, and launched a coordinated armored assault into the flank of the German salient. Military historians at institutions like the Army War College would later analyze this maneuver for decades. The British military theorist Basil Liddell Hart called it one of the most impressive feats of mobile warfare in the entire conflict. Even German commanders who faced Patton's forces, men like General Otto von Manschufel, acknowledged privately that the speed of the American counterattack shattered their expectations and wrecked the timetable of the German offensive. Von Manschufel had expected at minimum a week before American forces could respond with meaningful strength. Patton gave him 3 days. 3 days that cost Germany any realistic chance of salvaging Operation Autumn Mist. This is the midpoint of a story that changed the course of history, and if you haven't already, now is the moment to subscribe to this channel, like this video and share it with a friend, a history lover, a veteran, or anyone who has ever wondered what real leadership looks like when everything is on the line. Leave us a comment below telling us something you didn't know before watching, whether it's the Verdun Conference, Patton's preemptive orders, or the exact date that Bastogne was relieved. Your comments keep this community alive, and every share puts this story in front of someone who needs to hear it. George Patton died on December 21, 1945 in Heidelberg, Germany, from injuries sustained in an automobile accident just 12 days earlier, less than a year after his greatest triumph. He never returned to American soil alive. He was buried in Luxembourg among the soldiers of the Third Army, at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Ham, in a decision he reportedly would have endorsed. His death at 60 robbed the world of one of its most ferocious military minds at the very moment when a new and terrifying geopolitical order, the Cold War, was beginning to crystallize. Some historians have speculated that Patton's outspoken and increasingly public hostility toward the Soviet Union, his statements that the Western Allies had defeated the wrong enemy, might have created explosive political complications had he lived. But history does not trade in might-haves. It deals in what happened, and what happened is that Patton's Third Army in the winter of 1944 saved the Allied campaign in Western Europe at a moment when it was genuinely threatened with catastrophic failure. Harry S. Truman became the 33rd President of the United States after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945. Truman had served as a field artillery officer in World War I and had a soldier's deep respect for operational competence. When Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who had commanded Patton, became the 34th president in January 1953, the two men, Truman and Eisenhower, had a relationship that was complicated, sometimes cold, marked by sharp political differences. But there were moments, documented in historical accounts and memoirs from the period, when the two former leaders spoke candidly about the war they had both inhabited from different vantage points. In those conversations, Truman, who as president had access to intelligence summaries, after-action reports, and classified assessments of the Ardennes campaign, spoke about Patton with a reverence that surprised even those who knew Truman's generally restrained approach to praise. He said, in effect, that what Patton had done in December 1944 was not merely impressive. It was something that shouldn't have been possible by any reasonable calculation of military logistics and human capacity. Truman's account, as reflected in historical records and the recollections of aides from that era, captured something essential about the nature of Patton's achievement that the formal military history sometimes failed to convey: that Patton had not simply executed a difficult maneuver. He had anticipated the need for it before anyone told him to do it, had begun preparing before he had permission, and had delivered results that exceeded not just expectations but the outer boundaries of what trained military planners believed could be accomplished in that environment, in that time, with those resources. Eisenhower, listening to Truman describe it, already knew every tactical detail. He had been there. He had given the order, or rather, had confirmed an order that Patton had already begun executing. But hearing it described from the outside, from a president who had studied it after the fact with the benefit of complete information, added a dimension that Eisenhower himself admitted was sobering. It was one thing to command Patton. It was another to fully grasp what Patton had been doing while no one was watching closely enough to stop him. The story of what Patton did in those frozen weeks of December 1944 is ultimately a story about the nature of leadership itself, about the terrifying loneliness of being the person in the room who sees clearly when everyone else is still adjusting to the shock of crisis. It is about the specific kind of courage required not to fire a weapon, but to make a decision that no one has authorized in a situation where being wrong means catastrophe, and being right means that history might not even record what you risked. Patton was not a perfect man. He slapped a hospitalized soldier in Sicily in 1943 and was nearly relieved of command permanently because of it. He made statements that were politically explosive, strategically reckless, and personally embarrassing to Eisenhower and to the Allied cause on multiple occasions. He was arrogant, theatrical, and consumed by a need for glory that he himself understood and could not fully suppress. But in the Ardennes, in December 1944, all of that noise fell away, and what remained was a commander who, when the moment demanded everything, reached into himself and found something that changed the war. And that is why, decades later, when two presidents sat together and the conversation turned to the war they had shared, and Truman told Eisenhower what Patton had really done, not the official version but the full weight of it, the room by all accounts went very quiet. Because some stories, when you finally understand them completely, don't need dramatic music or grand pronouncements. They just need silence and a moment to absorb the fact that history turned, in part, on the decision of one defiant, visionary, deeply flawed, and utterly irreplaceable man who changed orders beyond expectations before anyone even knew the expectations had been set. If this story moved you the way it moves us every time we return to it, please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that history is made by human beings, complicated, brilliant, maddening human beings, and leave a comment below telling us what moment in this story hit you hardest, what fact you didn't know before today, because your voice is what makes this community worth building, and every single share carries this story one step further into the world where it belongs.